So whilst you watch the video, I'm just going to give you some of the context around kamikaze pilots and Bushido code. So kamikaze pilots were essentially soldiers who were trained in a suicide mission where they would fly their plane into the boats of the enemy instead of trying to attack in a more traditional military style, as you can see them doing right now in this video. Across the end period of World War II, when this was taking place, they reckon about 3,800 kamikaze soldiers died in these acts of kind of what were essentially suicide attacks. They reckon only about 19% of attacks worked. So that tells you kind of, they did see it as quite a useful strategy, but also it wasn't highly effective. It's based, you might be thinking or questioning, why would they choose to do that? Why would the soldiers do that? The answer is that the Japanese military, there is a culture of, it's called the Bushido code, which comes from like samurai warriors, and it essentially means that death is more acceptable than defeat. So this was a way of samurai life, and they would believe that loyalty and honour was more important than death, and you were fighting for your country. It's kind of an extreme version of what we would call maybe patriotism. Now, I've got a quotation here from a samurai soldier which might give you a bit of insight into how they were feeling, because it's much more complex than just accepting death. So the quotation says, "Two souls reside in my heart. After all, I am just a human being. Sometimes my chest pounds with excitement when I think of the day I will fly into the sky. I trained my mind and body as hard as I could, and I am anxious for the day I can use them to their full capacity in fighting. I think my life and death belong to the mission, yet at other times I envy those science majors who remain at home. One of my souls looks to heaven, while the other is attracted to the earth. I wish to enter the Navy as soon as possible so that I can devote myself to the task. I hope that the days when I am tormented by stupid thoughts will pass quickly." And another quote here, "To be honest, I cannot say that I wish to die for the Emperor, that the wish to die for the Emperor is genuine, coming from my heart. However, it is decided for me that I die for the Emperor." So some people believe that these soldiers willingly kind of accepted this lifestyle, but there are more recent reports suggest that perhaps the soldiers weren't so happy about it. So there's a bit of contextual information, so we'll just get that down on the top of the page. So this one's on page 46 and 47. We'll just put that contextual information that I just talked through at the top. So we'll start with a kamikaze pilot. A kamikaze literally means divine wind. But I'll just simplify everything I've just said there. So, World War II, Japanese pilots who used suicide attacks aimed at US ships. We just put a note there, so generally this happened towards the end of World War I. I think it was later than 1941, but that's when Japan got involved in World War II following Pearl Harbor. And then just a note as well about Bushido. Code of warriors. Let's just put valued honour and loyalty to their country, to the Emperor, over death. That's a brief summary of some of the key contextual points of this poem. So that's the context summarised. Let's just have a read through the poem, have a little think to yourself what you think the message of this poem is, how it fits into the idea of power and conflict. So, Kamikaze. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats, strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in sways like a huge flag waved first one way, then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he never came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So this poem's a nice poem in terms of it's got ideas about power, it's got ideas about conflict, it's got nature, it's got memory in it. And it's essentially a story about a kamikaze pilot who decides not to complete his mission, not to commit suicide, and to come home. And when he comes home, his whole family, his whole community reject him because he doesn't follow through with the mission. And by the end of the poem, the question is, would it have been better to just die because nobody's speaking to him? Now, throughout the whole poem, we do not get the father's or the pilot's perspective. We hear the story being told by the daughter to her grandchildren. And so the voice, the narrator's, the speaker's perspective, it kind of is in a sense unreliable, and we don't necessarily get the full story. So we'll start with the opening stanza. So he leaves, and we'll go, so just a quick reminder as well that we use the highlighter codes. So it's the same in the other videos. So you're going to use pink for language devices, yellow for keywords, orange for general power and conflict ideas, and then green for structure. So I'll pick up some of those things as we go along. So the thing that I just said about voice we'll put into structure. So we'll start with this shaven head full of powerful incantations. Now this is really interesting. So an incantation is a spell. So when he begins his mission, he is planning to definitely go ahead with it. There's a couple of hints of that. The first one is this shaven head full of powerful incantations, which is obviously a metaphor. So we get the impression that he's under a spell, and that spell is the military lifestyle, the military code that he has to follow. I guess what we can discuss with this is there's a hint about the kind of brainwashing, or a more technical word would be indoctrination, of soldiers. And that in that way this part links really nicely to Bayonet Charge and how he too kind of loses, he becomes kind of a machine of war, and that's kind of what's happened here. He's under this spell. Also the idea of shaven head, like his head is empty. There's quite a lot to unpick there, but in terms of, if we talk more generally about power and conflict specifically, the other hint is this line here, a one-way journey into history. So we definitely get the impression that he wasn't intending to come back. But this idea of a journey into history is telling us that the soldier or the pilot wants to be remembered for his actions in war, and he wants to be seen as a hero. But something between here and when he turns around, something changes his mind. And it's never clear what that is, as I said, because we don't get the pilot's voice. So if we look at she here, so that pronoun, so third person pronoun, although we do get some of her actual words when it goes into italics. So that's because we never hear the father's voice / account of events. We hear it all through the daughter. So Garland is doing something interesting here with that use of voice, because we'll never truly know how he felt or why he turns around. If we look at, there's some really nice imagery in this in these next two stanzas, and we've got a couple of similes which we can unpick. So we've got strung out like bunting, and we've also got like a huge flag, which is the movement of the sea kind of waving like a flag, and then we've got boats that look like bunting from above. So both of these are kind of symbolic similes which unpick something about what's going. We can unpick them in relation to something that's going on in the pilot's head, perhaps. So a bunting is normally something that you would hang out for a celebration. This is where it becomes a bit complex. It can be read two ways. So is it a celebration of his mission, his bravery, or because he's about to turn back, is it him? Is this the family? And then for him it's a celebration of life and the decision to live. So it's a complex kind of simile there. And then the same again with this flag. And I'm going to talk about the flag in terms of a symbol. Now, a flag can be a symbol of, you know, your patriotism and nationalism. So we could read it as he's seeing it like a flag representing his country, and then his decision to be loyal to the country. Or because it's being waved, a flag can also be a symbol of surrender. So is that to do with the father's decision to turn back? Is that showing that he's kind of surrendered in this battle? So again, another kind of little confusing one that can be read either way. So if we move on to the following stanzas, and there's quite a lot of this, so I'm just going to pick some of it out for you. We've got dark shoals of fish here. We've got the turbulent inrush of breakers. That's the waves coming in from the shore. And then here, I'm not going to highlight all of it, but in this stanza we've got a description of a lot of different kind of types of fish. So we've got a lot of natural imagery in this poem. And there's lots of ways to look at this. Now, it can be seen that the natural imagery, it kind of evokes the memories that he has of his childhood. Because he sees his father, the speaker's grandfather, is a fisherman, and he sees these boats and he sees the fish from above, and it reminds him of waiting for his father to come back. So there's a real sense of memory in this poem and how memory can affect us, which links nicely to the emigre. But there's also, so memories of his childhood possibly makes him return. But there's also something possibly to be said about the beauty of nature, meaning that he is able to consider life in a kind of more deep, kind of philosophical way, that he's kind of contemplating life and death through watching these things of nature that then trigger these memories of his childhood. And then, just as I mentioned, things to do with memory, the verb remembered. And I think the nice way to look at this is it's almost like his life is kind of flashing before his eyes in that moment, in that journey. That journey to his death, everything's kind of coming back to him, and that particular memory I think is really interesting, of them kind of building pebbles up and waiting for the waves to crash them down, waiting for his father to return with all this kind of fish that he's caught. It's kind of very childhood imagery. And then what we have over here is this, and we'll do this in structure. So the italics is used, and we'll just highlight this bit here. Used to show the change in speaker. So in this case, up here, we get the sense of an interruption. So her children, or her child that she's telling it to, his children, plural, it is now asked her a question and she's answering the question. So it reminds us that this is being told by the daughter. So what you've got is you've got children listening to the story. You've got the speaker of the poem, who is the daughter. You've got the pilot is mentioned, and his wife is mentioned. And in terms of the pilot, what is also mentioned is his father, who is the fisherman. And his brother. But we only hear the voice of this person, and we can assume what this person has said, and we learn that the wife became quiet. But the story is all about the pilot. So there's a real, as I've said quite a few times, there's a real sense of distance from the truth, and arguably an unreliable narrator, as we call it, which is similar to My Last Duchess in terms of being told the story from someone's perspective who's going to tell it in a certain way. It's a very different way he's going to tell it, but he's trying to hide the fact that he's committed a crime and probably killed his wife. So we'll look at this bit that she says. There's some really interesting ideas in here. So in terms of conflict, what happens is when he returns, he loses everything. So his mother, his wife, never speaks to him again, and the neighbours too. And I just want to use that to make a comment about conflict. And there's a sense that the whole community is invested in the conflict, in this case World War II, and they feel a sense of national pride, which, because he doesn't deliver on his mission, they're not interested in him because he hasn't given his life for their country. So if you look at the idea, the verb to exist is kind of what this poem is about. I'm going to relate that word there down to when I come to the final line, which is quite an important line that we're left with. So we'll look at this here. So what we've got is one of your key quotations, so we'll move on to that now. Till gradually we too learn to be silent. So, what's going on here is that the children don't have the same understanding of this national pride, this way to view soldiers. And they don't grasp this kind of whole Bushido code and this need to behave a certain way and to fight. They don't understand nationalism and patriotism. So, conflict and patriotism is not fully understood by children, and it's hard to understand even as an adult. But conflict is also very difficult for children to understand. What you can also look at in this quotation is they go from chattered and laughed to silent. A huge juxtaposition there. So you've got the children initially being quite happy around him. So there's no indication that he's a bad grandfather or father. And then they go eventually to being silent, acting as if he never existed. And it's something they have to learn. So it's almost like children are taught this kind of code and this loyalty to your country, and in the end they lose their father as a result of it. And obviously the poet Garland is questioning whether that's right. Is it right that this whole community rejected this man because he chose to live? I've taught this poem quite a lot, and a lot of people bring up, is it similar to kind of a suicide mission? And in many ways, yes, because these soldiers are completely brainwashed. And by choosing not to complete their mission, they're rejected from their immediate community because they're seen as weak and cowards, even though what they've done is what the pilot in this poem has done is found the strength to live and to reject what is kind of forced upon him. And I guess the poem ends with this idea, which links back to this word existed. So they all act as if he doesn't exist, as if he's died. And this final line of the poem, and we're going to highlight it green because I think it's important that it is the final line. So we lose her voice, and it goes back to the kind of third person random speaker. Even though it's not in italics, it says she said, so there's kind of a weird blurring of the voices there. And it says, and sometimes she said he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. And it's interesting that Garland chooses that as the final line, because the reader is almost left with a question that we'll never know the answer to because we never hear his perspective. But the real question that's going on in this poem, as well as questioning, patriotism, what is death? So he doesn't die, not physically, but in many ways, emotionally and mentally and psychologically, he dies because he has no human contact. If everybody that you love and everybody in your community and your child and your wife were to disown you, do we exist without human contact? Are we only in the world to have relationships, to have emotions with other people? And it's kind of quite a sad ending, because after all that, after making the decision to return and choosing his family, he loses them anyway. So he may as well have carried out the mission. Okay, so that's the main gist of the poem. We'll just go to our structure and links notes. So let's just do this one here. Okay, so structure. So we've got use of change in speaker, italics used for daughter's voice. Now what you hopefully also noticed is that whilst the stanzas themselves are relatively regular, 6-line stanzas, there's a lot of enjambment, there's a lot of running on of ideas. I think the best use for me of enjambment comes in the 2 lines, the 3 lines actually, that are your key quotations. So you've got chattered and laughed, running on to till gradually. So there's a sense of things stopping there, but it is all part of the same idea, and that's how long it takes them. It doesn't actually take them that long to learn to be silent. We've got that lots of enjambment in this opening line. There's a lot of ideas packed into here. It feels like a lack of control maybe. So shaven head, one-way journey. And then what you've also got is it in this final line. He must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So just put in here enjambment equals lack of control, question mark. Similar to how it's used in Bayonet Charge. So we've got a few lots of poems you can link this to. So I've mentioned a few times Bayonet Charge. I would look at those 2 poems to do with ideas of patriotism, which also obviously would be a nice link to Charge of the Light Brigade. So you've got in this poem, they turn back. He turns back and he doesn't go through with it. In Charge of the Light Brigade, they do attack. They do turn back eventually, but when the battle's over, and they should be look at how the kind of community, the public, sees the soldiers. In Kamikaze, he's rejected from society, nobody wants to know him, they act as if he doesn't exist. But in Charge of the Light Brigade, he wants them to be celebrated and honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, Noble 600, they're seen as absolute heroes. So you've got those 2 to look at kind of patriotism. Another interesting one to compare it to is Poppies, and you could look at female perspective on war or the perspective of family on conflict and the impact of conflict on a family. Thinking less so about conflict but more general themes, the emigre would work nicely for ideas about memory, and therefore remains might do the same. And I'm just going to put in as well My Last Duchess for in terms of the use of an interesting speaker. And another, I mean, it links to a lot, but you could also look at the Prelude or Storm on the Island in terms of the power of nature, but a different kind of power of nature. Hopefully that all makes sense, and you've got your 3 key quotations down.